For those of you who don't know me, my name is Ling. My family and I came to the United States when I was 6 years old, after living in a refugee camp in Thailand. Growing up here in the US, storytelling has always been a cherished part of my culture. I started my YouTube channel back in 2017, but it wasn't until last year that I began translating my stories into English for this second channel of mine. I had actually started translating them 3 or 4 years ago, but life had other plans. Then last year, I was diagnosed with cancer. During my treatment, when my doctor took me off work, I decided it was time to dedicate myself to sharing these stories in English. And here we are today, with nearly 100 videos on this channel. I want to sincerely thank each and every one of you for your incredible support along the way. It means the world to me. So, sit back, relax, and enjoy these 5 short stories. Story number 1. My grandpa passed away a while back due to health problems that come with old age. He was healthy for most of his life and never wanted to see a doctor or go to the hospital until he started having kidney issues. To make a long story short, his kidneys began to fail, and eventually, he ended up on dialysis. His dialysis sessions were 3 times a week. At the time, I was a college student, so I would take my grandpa to his appointments and try to arrange my college schedule around his dialysis. For those who may not know, people with kidney failure often develop anemia because the kidneys play a role in stimulating the bone marrow to produce red blood cells. When the kidneys fail, this can lead to anemia. People who are anemic often feel cold, even in the summer, and my grandpa was no exception. During the summer, he would wear winter clothes inside the house because he was always cold. After being on dialysis for a few years, my grandpa passed away in the hospital due to an infection that was completely unrelated to his kidney problems. When he passed, our family and relatives gathered at his bedside before he was taken to the morgue. Afterward, we all returned home to start planning his funeral. Since we lived in a small town with limited options for funeral homes, we were only able to schedule a service 2 weeks out. At the time, cell phones weren't common yet, but my family had 2 cordless home phones. Almost every night, I would talk to my girlfriend on the phone, and when we were done talking, I'd leave the phone by my side. For a few nights after my grandpa's passing, the phone would ring with an unknown number. When I answered, there was nothing but static. Sometimes I could hear faint mumbling, as if someone was speaking far in the background. This happened a few times, and every time I checked, if it wasn't my girlfriend calling back, I'd hang up. One night, I was talking to my girlfriend late into the night. It was around 1 a.m. when we hung up. I got up to use the bathroom quickly, came back to bed, and the phone rang again. I assumed my girlfriend was calling back, as she had a habit of staying awake for a few minutes after our calls because she couldn't fall asleep right away. I quickly picked up the call, and clear as day, it was my grandpa. He said, "Come pick me up. It's cold here." The line was very static-filled, but I could tell it was him. Goosebumps ran all over my body, and I immediately hung up. I took the cordless phone back to the dining room to charge it. As I walked back to my room, the phone rang again, but stopped after 2 rings. I was so creeped out that walking back to my room felt like someone was following me. The next day, I told my mother about it. She said, "Maybe it's because your grandpa is still at the morgue. He's cold." My family is very superstitious, by the way. After we held his funeral and buried him at the cemetery, the late-night calls finally stopped. As much as I love my grandpa, the experience left me shaken, and I refused to keep the phone by my side at night after that. Thank you for listening. Story number 2. As a man, I've always wanted at least 3 kids. I especially hoped for a son to carry on my name. However, our first child was a daughter. We named her Ellie, and she was the cutest thing ever. After Ellie turned 1, my wife and I decided to try for another baby. We still dreamed of having 3 children, but we were already in our mid-30s. After about 4 years of trying, my wife wasn't able to get pregnant again. We visited our doctors several times and followed their advice. My wife got herself checked out, and while she still had eggs, no matter how much we tried, she couldn't conceive. Feeling discouraged, we turned to religion. We prayed at church and made offerings to our ancestors, asking for their blessings to have at least one more child, hopefully a boy. One evening during dinner, Ellie asked for some milk. Her mother poured her a cup and gave it to her, thinking she'd drink it while eating. But Ellie didn't drink the milk. After she finished eating, she walked to the front door and left the cup of milk there. I asked her what she was doing, and she said, "Daddy, there was an old lady and her baby boy at the door this morning, and they wanted some milk." Ellie's behavior was strange, but I thought it was kind of cute. Her mother told her to drink the milk before it spoiled, but Ellie insisted on leaving it there for the lady and her baby boy. That night, we went to bed. My wife and I forgot about that cup of milk at the door. The next morning when I got up to get ready for work, I poured the cup of milk down the sink and put the cup away. A few mornings later, I noticed milk spilled under the refrigerator and found a cup of milk sitting by the door. Ellie must have gotten up during the night and left it there again. I cleaned up the spill and went to work. Later that evening, I asked Ellie if she had gotten up to leave milk at the door. She said she had because the baby boy was crying and hungry. My wife, who was listening, told Ellie that from now on, she would feed the milk to the baby boy instead. She doesn't want Ellie to leave milk at the door anymore. Ellie smiled and agreed. Not long after that, my wife missed her period. When she took a home pregnancy test, we found out she was pregnant. A few months later, we learned we were having a baby boy. When we showed the ultrasound picture to Ellie, she immediately said, "That's Eli. Eli is the baby at the door." My wife and I exchanged a glance, chalking it up to a child's imagination. We decided to name our son Eli. In our culture, we believe that when you pray for a baby, an old ghost delivers the baby to you and your spouse. However, the ghost stays around for a while to ensure you love and care for the baby. If you don't, the ghost takes the baby back. Some people in our culture believe that sudden infant death syndrome happens because the old ghost decides to take the baby away. Thank you for listening. Story number 3. My husband and I have 2 children. Our older child, Kate, is 7 years old, and our younger one, Evelyn, is 2 years old. I'm a stay-at-home mom, while my husband works the night shift and usually gets home around 8 a.m. One day, my grandmother passed away after a year-long illness. During her funeral, we had a babysitter watch Evelyn, while my husband and I took Kate to the service. Shortly after the funeral, something happened that still creeps me out when I think about it. I usually put my kids to bed early, around 8 p.m. Kate doesn't nap during the day, so she typically falls asleep without any problems. However, Evelyn, my 2-year-old, had trouble going to bed one night. She kept getting out of bed, likely because she had taken a long nap during the day. My husband and I share a large bedroom with a bathroom, so around 9 p.m., I decided to put Evelyn in the bedroom with me. I locked the door so she couldn't wander off while I showered with the bathroom door open. As I was showering, Evelyn came in, mumbling something. Then she walked back out into the bedroom. After I finished my shower, I went back into the bedroom, but she wasn't there, and the door leading into the hallway was open. I then heard the sound of the swing in the kids' playroom down the hall. At first, I thought Evelyn was just pushing the swing. However, when I got there, Evelyn was sitting in the baby swing, swinging back and forth. There was no way Evelyn could have climbed into the swing by herself. I quickly took her out and called for Kate, thinking she might have woken up and put Evelyn in the swing. I went to Kate's room, but she was still sound asleep. I closed her door and asked Evelyn how she got into the swing. Evelyn replied, "It's Nima. Nima swing me, Mommy." It was late, and her words gave me chills because Nima was what we called my grandmother. I felt uneasy but decided not to dwell on it. I closed the playroom door, took Evelyn to her room, and rocked her to sleep. The next day, while I was making breakfast, my husband came home from work. He usually plays with the kids for a bit before eating, showering, and going to bed. As I cooked, he played with Kate and Evelyn in the playroom. When breakfast was ready, I called them over to eat. After we sat the kids down, my husband washed his hands, sat at the table, and said, "Why does their playroom smell like that strong perfume your grandmother used to wear?" His comment sent chills down my spine. My grandmother had issues with incontinence when she was alive, so she often wore heavy perfume to mask the odors. It could be overpowering at times, and the smell was unmistakable. I went to the playroom to check for myself, and I could still smell the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. It was strange and unsettling, but I like to think she was just stopping by to see her grandchildren one last time before moving on. Story number 4. This event took place in Central California back in the late 1990s. My parents rented a piece of land to farm and grow the crops and herbs they were used to from Southeast Asia. Sometimes I would help them sell their vegetables and herbs at the flea market. I remember one Saturday, my father went to the flea market early to set things up. He had already taken some cucumbers and vegetables to get started. My husband had gone on a fishing trip that morning with his friends, so it was just me and my 2 little boys at home. My sons, Kai and Lee, were 5 and 3 years old at the time. That morning, my mother called and asked if I could go to the farm with her to pick up some lemongrass. She and my father had forgotten to grab some the day before for the flea market. I told her that my husband was fishing and I was home watching the boys. She suggested I bring them with us. My parents lived only about 5 minutes away from my house. Shortly after, my mother arrived, and we took my car to the farm since it had car seats for the boys. We arrived early in the morning, just as the sun was beginning to rise. However, it was partially cloudy that day. The farm was near a canal. When we got there, I parked the car on my parents' land and told Kai and Lee to stay inside. I figured it wouldn't take long to pick some lemongrass. I gave each of them a bag of corn nuts to keep them occupied. About 20 minutes into gathering lemongrass and bitter melon, I suddenly heard my mother shouting, "Lee, get away from the canal!" I was picking bitter melon when I saw my mother emerge from the lemongrass patch. She ran toward the canal, frantically looking into the water. I dropped what I was doing and ran over to her, asking what had happened. She told me she had seen Lee standing at the edge of the canal before sliding down on his bottom toward the water. I panicked and started yelling for Lee. That's when I heard Kai calling out, "Mom! Mom! Something happened to Lee!" I turned and saw Kai standing outside the car with the door open. He was pointing into the car and shouting, "Mom! Something happened to Lee!" Confused, I shouted back, "Where's Lee?" Kai replied, "He's in the car." It was so strange. I ran to the car and saw Lee still strapped into his car seat, but his head was slumped forward. I quickly unbuckled him, slapped his back lightly, and tried to wake him up, but he wasn't responding. I realized he might be choking on the corn nuts. I started patting his back harder, and thankfully, he coughed up a piece of corn nut. He woke up crying but was otherwise fine. After that scare, my mother and I decided we had enough lemongrass and bitter melons for the day, so we headed home. On the way back, my mother told me again that she was certain she had seen Lee by the canal. She described how he had sat down on his bottom and slid toward the edge. But Lee had been in the car the entire time. It was such a strange and unsettling experience. I have no idea what my mother saw that morning, but I'm grateful nothing serious happened to Lee. Story number 5. My cousin Jin could drink a lot. He was one of those guys who would finish your drink if you didn't. We used to hang out at his place and play all kinds of board games. Unfortunately, his wife divorced him because she said she no longer felt the same, whatever that means. After the divorce, Jin started hanging out at bars after work, and his drinking got worse. He already had high blood pressure at the age of 38, and the excessive drinking made it worse. Eventually, his kidneys started to fail, but what ultimately got him was liver failure. I watched as his skin turned yellow, a condition the nurses called jaundice. His doctor prescribed some medicine to help him flush out excess ammonia from his body, a consequence of his failing liver. Jin moved back in with his parents, as his doctor didn't think he had much time left. According to his parents, Jin began hallucinating due to his elevated ammonia levels. They asked us to visit him when we could. I was busy working a full-time and a part-time job with a wife and 3 kids at home, but I made time to visit him whenever I could. One day, I told my wife I'd stop by to see Jin after work. That evening, after leaving work at 5 p.m., I went to his parents' house. Jin was in his room, lying on the couch and watching TV with a board game at his feet. When he saw me, he sat up and greeted me. We shook hands, and I sat down next to him and the board game. I noticed it was a Ouija board. Curious, I asked him what he was doing with it. Jin told me he was using it to talk to our deceased relatives, including my father, who was his uncle. My father had passed away a long time ago, when I was still in high school. I know that when people are dying, they often become more spiritual, or start believing in the paranormal. I talked with Jin for a while, although there were moments when he didn't make much sense, likely because of his liver issues and high ammonia levels. Before I left, Jin said to me, "Hey, I talked to your dad while playing the Ouija board. Your dad told me he saved some money for you. You should ask your mom about it." I replied, "Okay, I'll ask my mom." I patted him on the shoulder and left. The following month, Jin passed away in the hospital due to liver failure. About a year later, my wife and I were working on buying a house. That's when my mother told me that my father had left some money for me in an investment account. It was under my mother's name, and she had never told me about it because she was worried I might slack off if I knew the money was there. Since I was her only child, she had kept the money for me. She withdrew it, and it turned out to be quite a lot. It was enough for me to buy a house outright in cash, but instead, I used a big portion for a down payment, saved the rest, and quit my part-time job. To this day, I don't know if Jin was just hallucinating, or if he really spoke to my father through the Ouija board. Either way, I'm grateful that my old man, who worked for a bank, had the foresight to set me up financially. Thank you for listening to my story. That's all for this video. Thank you for making all the way through and supporting my stories. Have a wonderful day or night.